Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Hello.
Happy Tuesday, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good
There it
morning.
is. Today's topic, we're going to jump into talking about an article that came out on the Fabric blog. If I had a little sound effect, I would go, yay, and a little clapping sound, because this I think, is the first blog article written by Chris Webb on the Microsoft Fabric blog. So we're going to talk a little bit around the reading data from the new function that now exists inside Power Query inside M. You can now read Delta Lake tables or the Delta Lake with a new M function, which I think this is also very telling to the hand of where Microsoft is going with a lot of this Delta technology things and how they're incorporating it into every part of their product everywhere that you see it.
Should be an interesting conversation. Also, Chris Webb, awesome guy.
Love his articles, very detailed. I've learned so many things from him. I love his stuff. Anyways, he's so good. So happy that he's on the Microsoft team and pushing out extremely good articles like that.
Speaking of other cool people on the Microsoft team.
Yeah, let's jump into Zoe Douglas talking about, she had a release on the blog for Power BI. Again, it's kind of hard jumping between the two different blog pieces here. So here's the blog from the Power BI side of things. There's an announcement being made around, as of November release of Power BI Desktop, there's now a public preview for the Power BI DAX Query View. Really interesting to see what's going on there. So reading through the article and actually playing with desktop a bit, it allows you to write DAX directly inside Power BI Desktop. And you've been able to do that before, but this is actually using like an evaluate. You can see a table that renders beneath of what the DAX is doing. There's a whole bunch of other things here. You have a better command bar. You have its own ribbon on the page. So this is yet another icon that lives on the left-hand side of your screen that you can click on and dive a little bit deeper in on the DAX. What are your thoughts? Do you like it? Is it needed?
It's awesome.
This is one of those products. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, the thing that pops off the first for me is when we start talking about or have talked about how do you create your DAX queries, right? Like, first thing, create a table. Like, not.
Yep.
This sets up how you would want to, like, put together your measures, validate that they're working the way you would expect them, and having this as a separate experience with the hooks that it does. And I won't explain the whole article, so I can let Tommy talk. But like the hooks it's very seamless from a blogger perspective. So look forward to like your interaction with it. I haven't played with it yet, which I'm kind of tempted to throw in my meeting schedule today and just go play, but that's easier said than done.
True statement.
It's definitely one of those features. The first 5 minutes you start playing with, you go, how is this not a thing before? Because you're right.
That's a great point, Tommy. That's a great point.
It's much more than just DAX queries. If that was the only thing here, still incredible. But the fact that from I don't even want to say a developer point of view, but just from an advanced author point of view, I can look at my dependencies for a measure very easily and add that all in from a defined point of view. The feature set that they released, stage 1 or alpha or whatever we're calling this, is already great. Just the ability alone, if the first and only feature set here was just to be able to run and evaluate, is already something that I'm using consistently. It's not taking away from my favorite tools in the world, my external tools. But for a lot of organizations, external tools are not a thing, or there's a lot more limitations there, a lot more barriers there. The fact that this is built right in for either a new user or someone with maybe not privy to all the external tools is something that's going to help their own DAX. It's going to help also their own accuracy and their own workflow.
I like how you're thinking about that, Tommy, because that's one of the challenges I've had in general working with visuals and writing measures and dropping them to them. To your point earlier, Seth, if you can't get the visual to run, so at some point in time, you kind of get to a point where I'm comfortable with what's going on. I know how to build these DAX measures, and you don't really build like a table and then transition into building the visual. You just kind of build the visual with the measures and things that you have. But there are times when things go slow. And one of the features that I really like about this new tool is when you're inside the performance analyzer, So if you're on a page inside desktop and you're looking at the performance of the page, which that is a specific window that you can have open, you can refresh all your visuals and you can then pick out from that. There's now a new icon in the performance analyzer that says run in DAX query view. So you can grab a visual, see what it does, go run the automatically executed DAX directly inside the view, and then it shows you, like, it literally writes it out for you correctly with the proper syntax. And if you do just something simple, I mean, it runs a lot of code. I mean, I just did a simple bar chart with a couple like a legend and some quick measures in there.
Yeah.
And there's like, I'm looking at here, the code to write that single table is 184 lines. And it's a bar chart with like 4 fields in it. That's it. So there's a lot of code being written there. And I think it really helps a user to go back and say, what is actually occurring here? Let me understand what the DAX code is doing. Because this is the part that you couldn't do earlier, which was sometimes you need to dissect the code.
Yeah. And that that point right there, even I see a lot of potential here in how they didn't just make it. What I love about it is they didn't just make it the separate thing, right?
Yes.
The flow here, where through something they call code lens or whatever, like quick queries evaluate to go from your model where you may already have queries, where you may already have something that's just not lining up, and then
Yes.
have a seamless experience to pop into this experience, this pane, right? And then also make your push your changes back into the model like that. It's very well thought out. And I would imagine this becomes like the way I manage all my measures or interact with them in the tool.
And that's a really big point here because, like I said, the DAX query itself is incredible, but the fact that it's, dare I say, more seamless than an external tool.
Oh yeah, totally.
Right?
Dare say it.
You dare say it.
No, but
and that's you would
right.
expect that though. You want that to be what you want.
But you'd also expect they have this DAX query that's completely separate, even though it's in the model. No, I think the biggest win here is it is part of your normal workflow. It is already integrated in the model you're in.
Yes.
So, and that to me is one, I think part of, for first-time users or intermediate users, get used to this, get comfortable with this. But even for ourselves, does this make more sense than using DAX Studio in a lot of circumstances?
Now, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but there is full, I mean, whatever you're seeing here, there's a lot of things that mirror what you're seeing in Visual Studio Code. So there is command prompts for Control Shift P or Control Alt, what is it? Control Alt P.
Hotkey guy, here he comes.
Here we go. Hotkey guy is in here now. But when you're doing this, there's a command palette. There are so many commands. Move cursor to below, move cursor to end, select and find match, find next match, Control D. There's a whole bunch of really awesome Visual Studio Code commands that you use to navigate around code. All of that now exists in this editor. And I think some of the things that are going to be underrated that are here that I want to point out are there's a format query button. So you can make changes and it will reformat the query using a formatting pattern. Now, I don't know where it's getting its formatting stuff from. I wonder if it's using the SQL BI API. I probably doubt it because it's going to be at scale. It needs to do something very big to do that. But however, it's very nice to see that there's like hundreds of quick commands that are in here that you can use to manipulate this window so people can actually see the DAX. You can fold level 1 by using Control K, Control 1, Control K, Control 2. So when you have nested elements, it will fold them together and shrink them down for you. It's amazing what they can do here. So very interesting to see what's going on in this space.
Real quick with the options, I remember when Visual Studio Code, when I started using it, I hated the command palette at first. I was incredibly intimidated by it. With all the options, I liked being able to select it. I didn't know what was available. For those who've never used Visual Studio Code, and now this is your feature set, your option set, it's not a large learning curve. Don't feel too intimidated from it, because I know that happened to me with VS Code. It's like, this is too much. But now that's just, I expect every application I have to have a command palette. So,
and other things I'll just randomly point out here. Using the Alt key to get multiple cursors is a dream come true. I mean, that's just, it's so good. This is not a brand new business user tool. This is for the professionals that are really in and doing data modeling. I was recently on a phone call with a client, and we were kind of talking about some things, and what came to mind was they're like, well, we want to build reports. And we kept talking about reports. Power BI desktop isn't as much as a report building tool. It does do that, but it's actually a data modeling tool. And actually, it reminds me of an article that comes from SQL BI that this is really pushing into what Microsoft, I feel like, should have been pushing into all along. Is it's more of a data modeling tool that brings together tables and queries and helps you tune DAX. This is what this tool needed to be from day one. We're just now getting to it.
I knew you were going to be a big fan right out of the gate with this feature enablement. I mean, when their lead-in blog has shortcuts and short keys for you, I mean,
you are hitting on all the right buttons.
All in.
I don't want to use my mouse. Less click. There's not a lot of clicks.
Right.
I mean, to run it, there's not a lot of clicks to make it go do its thing. Like, that's what you want. That's a sign of a good feature inside the tools. There's less clicks now to go do something you've never been able to do before, but it's simple.
You know, the best part, F5 doesn't refresh the browser because it's not a browser. It's on your desktop still. So just want to say that.
There's actually a really good question that came in from Natalie. She's just starting to learn DAX Studio. Should she just use this instead?
Oh, this is a great question.
There's too much overlap to say you can't one or the other.
Well, this is a good question, because I think this really helps you point at is there any shortcomings that you see between what DAX Studio does and what this one does? So my initial reaction is I don't get to see some more of the technical pieces of how the query is executing. I see it run, I get a little success or not success, and it tells me an output. How many milliseconds did it take to run? So cool. That is very similar to what DAX Studio is doing. However, DAX Studio does a little bit more query planning pieces. So it shows you, like, okay, when you have an efficient DAX thing, you're going to the storage engine or the compute engine. Is that right? The SE and the CE, right? Yep. Okay. So when you're jumping into the DAX and you're looking a bit more in detail as to why was it slow, I feel like DAX Studio still has a bit of an edge against what this is doing. This is more like, hey, this code ran. You can now pick apart the code and run snippets of it, which is fine. But you're not really getting like the tuning performance tool set that you would need to optimize more of the DAX statement or the visual or whatever you're doing in the measures. Does that make sense?
No, I'm 100% with you. There's a bit of this where it's like DAX Studio diet version, because when I'm trying to run multiple parts, the compute engine, the Vertipack analyzer, which is also in DAX Studio, if you're on the intermediate to advanced side, you would completely still want to become an expert in DAX Studio. I don't think this takes away from that at all.
Nope.
No.
If anything,
There's also a lot of other things that you can do with DAX Studio related to like connecting to the model, seeing what's going on with size, spacing, and like even beyond that. But yeah, I like I agree. Excuse me. The optimization aspects definitely are very, very verbose and well done in DAX Studio. But having said that, with this new preview feature, I would start getting comfortable with it in the desktop, because it's going to be like the de facto place that you're going to be able to see whether or not your measures tie out the way you would want them to. And it is a much better experience than trying to do that, with your right click and just creating it in the code panel, the code snippet, So I think it's going to be a natural progression in the tool as you progress in DAX, as you progress into, the more nuanced aspects of it. Then DAX Studio is still a fantastic tool, and I think there's not replacing it, and I don't think that's what they're doing here. They're just making it more I think straightforward for us to understand and make sure that what we're building from a modeling perspective and queries is tying out the way we would expect it to. which is great.
Another thing I'll point out here too that I think DAX Studio has another edge. I mean, clearly it's for the developer of things, but I think you point this out too, Seth, and I want to re-emphasize this. When you're tuning a model, you're looking at which tables are the largest, where is the column that has the most amount of unique records in them. There's not like a simple amount of or there's not a way of looking at the Vertipack analyzer. So a Vertipack analyzer is like a thing that comes with DAX Studio. It shows you all the tables, the sizes. Now, I'd have to imagine, since this is a cube and you are writing DAX against it, you could probably write the DMVs or write views inside this editor to output tables of data of that. But then you would need to know exactly what you're writing. It's not like a drag and drop experience. So the experience that you get, I think, with DAX Studio still is you get that really nice, rich editing piece as well.
Another fashion of this is if you're learning DAX Studio, learn it all the way, and then like everything you learn there is
that's a good point,
transferable right into this query view. You'll just notice that there's these differences.
I think that's actually a really good point there, Seth. If I had to give you recommendations, start with DAX Studio, because this is all a watered down version of what that is already. So if you already know you need to get to that higher end tool, yeah, do it there. That makes a lot of sense. I agree with that a lot. Any other kind of final thoughts on this query blog or article here? Excellent. There's a lot of really interesting things coming out from desktops. There's probably some more interesting things that we'll be seeing here in the future, but we'll kind of keep tabs on the news coming out for all things Power BI, either both on both blogs, on Power BI blog and on the Fabric blog. There's a lot of. I feel like right now, when Fabric came out initially, I was overwhelmed. For whatever reason, the end of the year, they must be just kind of ramming in a bunch of features just before the end of the year. Because again, I'm feeling overwhelmed and like, oh my gosh, they're adding so many things. It's hard to keep up on all these new little additions on all the features.
Well, that's what this podcast is for. It's a bit of a support group.
It is a support group.
We had a little break. I'm sure they're not going to do the release in January. Then it's going to be the big conference with 18,000 more features come March. So got a little break now, I think.
I feel like I'm seeing a ton of articles. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I'm seeing a ton of articles just around all the things you can do with notebooks. It feels like notebooks is this new untapped arena that no one has been playing with. It is.
Cool kid, yeah.
And it does so many things. This thing called Semantic Link is now out. Phil Seamark is now blogging about, hey, you can go now create a visualize your Power BI refresh using Semantic Link. And he's building a table in a notebook, and then he's turning it into a Deneb visual. And he's like loading Deneb visuals inside a notebook and rendering them inside the context of a notebook with like a timeline and all this. It's incredible what people are doing in notebooks now.
I don't want to stray too far, but this is a really good point that happened to me last week. As cool as notebooks are, and I am all in trying to do it every day, just loving all the features there. That being said, this should not take away what the benefits and what's data flows and Power Query can still do incredibly well. I was noticing I was trying to do everything in a notebook. I'm like, wait a second, I could do this in 2 minutes in Power Query if I wanted to. Maybe that's from the skill point of view, but it's also the UI. And really, again, data flows are not just a beginner level tool, and Power Query is not just a beginner level tool. However you want to put it, however you want to put it, it may look like it, but the processing, what the capabilities there, everything has a place. And it doesn't mean that notebooks should take a place of everything. There are some things, data flows, there are some things that Power Query does better than notebooks. There's a lot of things notebooks do better, but it doesn't mean there's one that encompasses all. And that's been my kind of realization the last probably like 10 days.
Yeah, this will be very... for those of you who are listening to the podcast right now, Tommy was talking and I kept smiling really big here. And as you're so involved with these tools and what's happening, I'm smiling because your comment, Tommy, around Power Query is not an intro level tool, which I would agree with. Like it takes a little bit of time to figure out the patterns and how do you make it work. But it is more simple. It is simpler than what you'd be doing inside notebooks.
All UI.
Yeah, it's less like a extreme
the barrier to entry is lower.
100%.
Yes.
100%.
Right? Like what is that curve? And I know you see it probably in Gil Review's book, right? Where like you can do 70% of
90%
everything you
with
need to
UI.
in the
Yeah.
UI, right?
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, then it ramps, as opposed to you have a notebook.
You
Go
need
for
Python.
it.
Yeah, exactly. Just
Yeah.
here's a cell. Go at it. So
So Adrian asks in the comments here, which I think is another good comment here, and I'd like to comment on this one as well. I've seen a lot of SQL code being placed inside notebooks. Why not just create a SQL database and the objects and call them instead? A great point, but I think, in my opinion, here is the reason why you find people using a lot of SQL is people know SQL. It's a very universal language. It's very easy to understand. It's extremely powerful. It can do so many manipulations on things. So I honestly, my opinion, if I'm going to write SQL, I would prefer to write it in a notebook rather than an actual like SQL server, because the way the queries run, it's easier to like have multiple commands with different lines of code of SQL in them. So for me, logically, I just really enjoy the development experience of a notebook in general. That's just the experience that I like. That aside, there's a whole bunch of other technical challenges around like, well, if you're doing SQL, what kind are you doing? Are you using SQL serverless? Where's it come from? Do I want to pay for another machine, or am I already going to use the compute from Power BI to do the notebooks? There's a whole bunch of other, I think, considerations that go along with why you wouldn't want to just run SQL in a SQL server. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, whatever solution you're coming up with, you want a system that has less things in it, whatever that may be. So when you're going from raw data to a Power BI data set with something like a rendering report, the less hops I can make with the data, the more efficient, the faster the process will be, the easier it will be to run. So
Yeah, I think
start with simple. Start simple.
Yeah, I think I would answer it in a different way. From the standpoint that I like what Microsoft has done from mirroring, right? Like Azure SQL database, like you can leave the data there and pull it into a Fabric environment and get use out of it. Join creating. Um, it, Adrian's point is like, so you've seen a lot of SQL code. Why not create SQL database objects and call them instead? And then follows up with, but creating SQL database objects is about reusability and maintenance. I think where you're a fan, I'm a fan of Delta tables, have been for a very long time, is because like you're talking about large data sets, for one.
Yeah. Yeah.
For two, it's a completely different framework by which we're interacting with data underneath the covers. The fantastic thing about Fabric is we now have user interfaces that plug into those same backend structures. And ultimately, like the things that you get with Delta tables that are, I think, a much better experience than SQL is the cloud scalability, because it's all predicated based on Spark, right? So you can infinitely scale. These are just files. It's also, there's some really unique things related to like reliability and versions. It is extremely quick for you to interact with a table, and I cannot tell you how many times like you go through a massive load and all of a sudden it's like, what did somebody just like took
Or
like,
something. Something's
nuke my
broke.
table? Where's my
Yeah.
table?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yep. Let me just revert, and it instantly reverts back to the previous file sets, right? So the underpinnings of how all of that is operating is completely different from a data storage, indexing. Like Delta tables are individualized Parquet files, right? That then have versions applied on top of them, right? And then you have a pointer to the right files, and it just works seamlessly. You still get the same ACID transactions, etc. So being put into environments like Databricks or now Fabric, where you have notebooks and you're interacting with them via SQL code, completely different underpinnings, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I find a lot of value. You get a lot. You get very used to how notebooks operate, and frankly, like working between data engineering teams and front end teams, is very seamless, because you can have somebody pop in, write a Python function that executes at the beginning of the notebook, and then your next things are in SQL, and then or pop
Everyone's
into Scala
happy.
because the functions of like inserting or creating something, of you cleaning, optimizing, whatever the case may be. It's very flexible, and I think that to me is the biggest difference. I'm a huge SQL fanboy too, right? Like that's where I came from. But in terms of just those I think features of it have sold me, especially as it relates to just the performance and things at volume. And I think that's the important part, is when you start to ramp up, things operate much quicker, much better. You have a lot more flexibility in clustering, cluster sizes, types of clusters you can use with different workloads, et cetera, et cetera.
And one other note here I'll tack on to the end of this conversation here around that same point is, yes, there's two kinds of main workloads that I think, especially if you talk about what Databricks is doing, and I think Microsoft's going to mirror very much the same experiences. You already see it in their code today, or how they laid out the UI. There's this idea of data engineering with notebooks, getting data in, moving it around, creating tables, right? So you're essentially, in my mind, even though I'm using a notebook, it still is SQL. It's still a SQL server. Like the lakehouse is the server. The tables are inside the server. So you can roughly use the analogy here of the same stuff mentally, like the mental model, right? And again, I'm thinking from like the SQL developer who's used to like, I gotta go connect to my SQL server before I can see any tables in the database, right? All that kind of stuff. So that being said, looking at the next step beyond, after you've collected the data, now what? And this is the next portion that I think a lot of organizations are going to start getting to, is they're going to build piles of data. They're going to go collect everything, load them into tables. The next logical step is, let's go do data science, or let's throw some smarter math at our tables. And you need a tool that can do that. SQL by itself can do it in certain instances, but I've worked on projects where we've loaded R into a SQL server and ran R inside the server. It just created all kinds of headaches. It felt like it was just a bolt-on thing, and felt like, okay, that's weird. It didn't run as smoothly. It was store procedures. It was very clunky. But then when you move over to the notebook experience with delta tables,
it's just you being familiar with it.
I
could say, man, back in my SQL days, there's just a seamless experience. I'd store procedures, calling store procedures, and jobs, and hey, it's all of the same types of things. You're taking actions, you have orchestration, you just do it in different ways.
Well, this also brings up a great transition to our main topic today. So our main topic for today is really around going into the deep dive around what just came out from Chris Webb, which is, let's talk about reading data from data lakes. So this is clearly a direction Microsoft's going. Everything is touching delta tables now. And this is a great transition, which we didn't even mean to have it go this way, but let's go further. Let's talk about the main article for today. I'll put that here in the chat window as well. So here's the main topic for today, talking about the new Power Query functions that are now going to let you read Delta Lake tables with a new function, Delta Lake.table, in the M functions. So not very often that we get a brand new M function. Maybe they occur, and it's not a blog post.
Very
I don't know.
hidden.
Maybe, right?
Yeah.
So this was one that I think was very appropriately done by Chris Webb. Again, awesome. And again, congratulations, Chris. First blog post on the new website, the new blog site. So we really appreciate you writing this out. And I think the article talks, and it's high level on pieces of this as well. I'm not so sure I understand the utility of this function when looking at your local machine, because it does require you to have a Delta table created on your local machine in order to test things if you want. But I really feel like this function makes a lot of sense when you're talking about one lake somewhere else, where you're trying to connect to that one lake element and use that to go get those tables of data and load them into Power Query. So initial thoughts, any reactions to this article initially?
So there's a lot more than just your local folder. There's actually connecting to the ADLS Gen 2 API as a URL and putting that to a Delta Lake to table.
And maybe that was my point.
Yeah,
was like,
yeah,
I
it's
think
not
you're going to use that more than just the local version.
Now,
of that.
if you have the one lake on your computer, sure. I think for me, the bigger, I think if you look at this from a bigger point of view rather than just the function itself, this goes to me back to usually our past 7 years. Power Query has been near the end point. It's the end of your journey in data analytics. If I'm using Power Query, there's not a lot of other places we're going to go besides Power BI. The fact that they're now having this source, which I imagine this is going to be more with data flows, not so much Power BI desktop that are going to be using the Delta Lakes, that we're getting to a point now where Power Query is becoming more, kind of to our earlier point, like a notebook, where it's part of that ETL, part of that true integration side. I can connect to the Delta Lake, or a Delta table. And the feature set here is not just necessarily only connecting to a table. I can handle time, a history of a Delta table. I can look at nested structures. I can look at statistics if I need to of that Delta table. All these things to me are pointing at a much bigger picture here, where Power Query is becoming upgraded. Desktop is also becoming not so much like the end route of what we're doing, because this is significant. This is really significant on our normal workflow, our normal our conception of what Power Query is. Kind of, again, a bit of a background here. This function just simply allows us to connect to Delta tables, but allows us to use the feature set of Delta tables, not necessarily just convert it to a table that works in Power Query.
I agree with that one. There's a couple interesting extra quote unquote options that go with this function that I think are very relevant here. One of them is this thing called nested structures. And this seems purely geared towards a Delta table can absorb JSON structures and have complex structures inside a column. Power Query does not like that, frankly. I mean, it loves, like, it's got to be like a text thing. It's got to be like a single value. It does not like complex nested internal structures of like a JSON object, right? You have the keys that would define like the columns of the data, and then the values of those keys define the rows. Well, now they're giving you a nested feature, and in there you can define the max depth of those nested features. So as you think about like a JSON structure that comes back, there's nesting that occurs inside this object. There's another object inside that object. There's another object, and you can now specify that by using this. And I think it's also good to note here that by default, there's 32 levels of depth that you get. So if you have a really gnarly JSON structure that goes very deep, if you have more than 32 nesting structures, you won't be able to go any deeper than that. But that also means you'll prune data, or you'll cut out data if you have something that's deeper than that. Or if you change your max depth to a number, it will automatically lose data inside that initial read. So I think that's important to note. But maybe that's why this function exists specifically, because like this is a new kind of data structure that Power Query doesn't handle very well in the past. So maybe this is going to help out a lot there.
That is significant, because when Fabric first came out and Dataflows Gen 2, part of the workflow that I tested out was using Dataflows Gen 2 with OneLake in a lake house. And it was incredibly slow to try to integrate those files and, in a sense, push them to the lake house, which it didn't work well. And it's like, okay, this is not what Gen 2 is supposed to do. This is solving that problem. That's solving that hurdle that we're having, where Power Query just does not process files in a folder very well, in a sense, to get that nested table. To your point, Mike, they've realized that, and here's their solution, or at least their Gen 1 solution of that.
I agree with that one. Any other features that stood out to you? I mean, you talked about time travel too.
It's there. You can get different versions of the Delta Lake table, which is fine. And this is the other thing they had. Fabric had a blog probably like a month ago about time travel. You can show the time history in the warehouse. So, and these are all solutions. I mean, they've thought about this, and again, a more holistic view, not just, hey, we need the ability just to connect to a Delta Lake table. It's like, well, what are all the use cases someone's connecting to the Delta Lake table in any feature, not necessarily Power Query? Well, let's make sure we incorporate that. So this can be the workflow. This can be the main workflow of connecting and integrating with Delta Lake tables. And I think that's what they're trying to do here, is how can we make Power Query on par with something like notebooks or the pipeline to be that integration point.
This is one of the reasons why I'm really excited about this blog post. I'm excited about it is because there's so many things that the Delta table gives you out of the box by default, with all these cool features. And now we're going to start getting access to these things inside desktop. outside from the fact that I don't think I'll ever connect to a Delta table on my local machine, I'll probably always go find it in One Lake or some ADLS Gen 2 storage location. But I think this makes a lot of sense. One challenge I've been trying to face here, as I'm thinking through how to build these things, one area that has been in my mind that I'm trying to figure out here is the guidance from Microsoft. You think about like a deployment pipeline of things. There is this pattern of Microsoft expects you to kind of build 3 separate workspaces that all have different environment names. One of the challenges I've been looking at here was like, okay, I have a lakehouse in each of these environments. Lakehouse for dev, it's probably named the same. So I would assume you would name them all the same. So it's lakehouse, data lakehouse inside your dev environment in your workspace, inside your test environment, and in your prod. So you can use the Power BI deployment pipelines to move artifacts between all the things. But one thing that I'm again trying to wrap my head around here is how do you parameterize the lake elements, and so that the notebooks or the if you're doing some interesting naming conventions on how your environments are built, what is the thing that you can do to parameterize your data your semantic models, so that every time you're moving, you're getting a different lakehouse name, or you're moving that through. I'm assuming you can repoint everything like normal, like you would, a data set and a report repoint as you move them through the pipeline. I just need some more testing around this, because I think, yes, I'm very pro, like, let's just build everything in one environment, but I can't be so naive to think it's all going to fit in. You're not going to build everything in prod. It's not going to be just one environment. You're going to want to build multiples of these things and kind of work your changes through a pattern of a flow here. So I'm very excited to see that as well, because I think this new function will allow us to parameterize more of the artifacts and things we're making in the lakehouse. We'll be able to parameterize a bit better the data sets. I keep saying data sets. I still haven't transitioned fully over to semantic models. You'll be able to transition the semantic models between each of the environments as well, which will be interesting to see who's going to do that. I'm going to lean on John Kursky for that one and be like, John, you need to write us a blog. If the internet calls John Kursky to the stage, and can
the internet calls.
The internet calls. Is that how this works? You can just kind of like say it into the internet, and then the internet knows how to get. Someone will ping him, and he gets notified, and there will be a blog post in the next week. Yeah.
Kursky. No.
I summon the powers of Kursky to do data ops on top of whatever this is. Any other thoughts or things that roll up here as you look at this?
If this becomes maybe the question for both of you, for Seth, who I don't want to say he's Power Query pessimistic or leans that way, but there's obviously in Seth's mind, if I were to assume that in the order of operations of features and tools and languages of enterprise ETL, Power Query is probably not going to be in the top 5 of what it can normally do. I'm going to make that assumption here. I'll make that general assumption for most of the things. We have Databricks, you have Synapse, obviously we have pipelines. Power Query has never been that main feature. If they continue to adapt and continue to grow this connection feature in this feature set, can you see this becoming one of the main areas or the main feature sets of a workflow for ETL? Especially, at least in the realm of Fabric, especially.
Who are you asking?
Well, there's 2 of you, so I'll ask.
I was gonna let Seth go first. I have an opinion, maybe, but I'm kind of curious what you're gonna say, Seth.
I would say this: the vast majority. So, have I tested everything all the time? No. However, the reasons I would argue that Power Query isn't the go-to or de facto enterprise tool for me is because it doesn't perform as well, or isn't in the locations that I would need to plug it in to find a ton of value out of it. Now, is it being added to those different tools? Yes. Is the performance there the same way that it is in other ways I ingest large volumes of data? No. If it starts to perform the same, and it's being integrated in all these areas, and I can do things like this, I think that's a very compelling story for when we talk about how something graduates from, ad hoc level or even potentially business, where we're ingesting processes that they built and just plugging them into our enterprise ecosystem. It'd be much easier to do that. And I'd love to be able to do that, as opposed to like look at somebody's Power Query and be like, oh, okay, what we need to do is extract this, move this stuff that you're doing in here back one layer. If Power Query is a viable ETL tool back here and performs just as well as all of the other ways in which we can do things, it's not like I'm against Power Query.
No.
We got Alex in the chat. I'm not gonna like I love Power Query.
Oh yeah, you better watch your words carefully.
If only because I can go to conferences and listen to Alex talk about Power Query, because
we didn't even have to internet summon him. He just appeared.
There's only one thing that's better than writing M code, and that's listening to Alex talk about
listening to Alex that writes M code. That's the
right.
So I dream about that.
Like it's not, like I said, Tommy, it's not like I don't think that it isn't powerful. I do see value in it. I use it all the time. It's just not in the largest workload levels that we have. Right. It doesn't perform as well.
And for the record, I agree. But yeah,
and that could be because of the tools that it's in, that there are limitations. But like I said, we're in a new ecosystem where Microsoft is presenting us with the comfortable tool sets that we are familiar with from the front end, but they do not work the same. Right? Like, we're writing SQL. You have a SQL warehouse that's writing to Delta Parquet. That's not a backend SQL server, right? Like, there are things that are being introduced, I think, that could definitely change how these tools as we know them in the places that we see them interact differently.
Oh, I'm going to go back to your comment, Tommy, around like when to use something and when not to use something. I'm going to make an assumption here that if we're pulling data from a Delta table in general, we're pulling a star schema. Like so the idea here is like, this is Roach's maximum to the nth degree. Like, if I'm already technically enough that I'm making Delta tables, I'm assuming the data engineering that we're doing is at a level of, we understand what transformations need to be made. We know how to get data shaped. We're going to basically build everything that we need. Here's the fact tables that we need. Here are the dimensions we're going to go get. But all that abides upstream. It's in another place. And so I see this as being a very valuable feature for, okay, I've already got my star schema. I now need to get that into the model. Let's just do that portion. Right? To me, that makes a lot of sense. So if you're going to use this step, and to what Seth's point was saying was, I'm going to then rip apart a table. I'm going to go open up some JSON inside that table structure. If I'm going to do all these other transformations on top of it, in my mind, there's two things that need to occur here, right? One of them has to be, you have to let Power Query interpret those transformations, like selecting columns, removing data, picking out interesting things. Power Query has to be smart enough to kind of fold those transformations and push them back upstream. So I could envision a very similar pattern like you see when you do SQL queries. Like, here's the native SQL query that was run to go access that data, right? Things I think like joining like if you did this and you joined two tables together, it's going to be expensive because you have to load both tables into memory and then do the join to them. So like that kind of stuff would be things I would want to look for those in Power Query and say, let's just not do them in Power Query. Let's instead do them upstream somewhere else. So in this whole Fabric ecosystem, I have really felt like nothing in Power BI has changed. Everything from a semantic model forward is the same. What Fabric has done is it's opened up another whole area of the back end that we've never had access to before. Yeah. Delta tables, pipelines, like all this other really rich stuff, which that is where you should really be doing the heavier data engineering, I think, if you're talking about like a grow up strategy of Power BI.
So obviously this function offers the ability to plug into Delta tables a bit deeper and potentially better. What in your eyes, what's the difference between this, like, in the way from the Power BI perspective, like connect to Spark via Spark or Microsoft Azure Delta table connector?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that my perception here is this removes that middle compute layer, right? So you could never go read a delta table directly. So if you think about like the different compute engines you need to go read stuff, if I'm reading delta tables, the whole reason why we built Synapse in front of Power BI was because Synapse had this thing called SQL Serverless. SQL Serverless was able to go read the technology of the delta tables. And so I could say, oh, I'm going to create a bunch of delta tables in Databricks or whatever. There's 100 tables there now. How do I read them? Power BI Desktop had no way of actually reading what was the back end, like what was in those files, like in the delta tables. So now this function handles a lot of those the scenarios of like connecting to them. So now I don't need SQL Server in the middle. I don't need Synapse. I don't need a Databricks SQL endpoint to turn on just to write SQL against to get the data into Power BI
So
notebooks.
This function then is only for delta tables that live in the Microsoft ecosystem or on OneLake.
Ooh, this is a good question.
Because
I don't know.
I
don't know. It could be AWS too, right?
Well, what cluster are you using? You can't just plug into something without compute.
No, but I'm saying that's my point though. My point was you had to have compute before. This function moves that compute thing away from whatever you needed previously. So let me
does it though? Because like if I'm looking at
yeah.
Azure Storage Data Lake, Fabric Workspace. Okay, so if I'm on a Fabric Workspace, I already know I'm part of a capacity that I'm using something.
But the capacity compute is coming directly from the VertiPack engine. Like it's VertiPack that's now, because the function lives in VertiPack, the compute is coming from VertiPack, and that's why it says here in the article, Data Lake Gen 2 you can still use. There's no you could literally build a delta table in, and also this works on desktop, right? On desktop, I don't have any other Spark running. You don't need another engine. On desktop, you isolate all that away, and all you're focusing on is on desktop, it's just the files, and then VertiPack is directly reading those files and knowing how to read them. So my opinion here is I think this simplifies your pipelines. You no longer need, this is a huge implication. Like this is major, big deal here. You don't need another compute to read the delta tables, which is, again, I think a very smart directional move from Microsoft.
It would be incredible if they put that in function. I'm looking at the documentation and I think they still need to fill out a bit, but according to the documentation, not just the blog, if you have a Delta Lake table, you can return it. It doesn't say only in this certain capacity or only in a data lake or only in Azure. It simply says Delta Lake.table returns the content of a Delta Lake table. I think there's still some documentation on the limitations there that needs to be filled out, since this article came out 11/15, or the documentation on Power Query docs.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, to your point, it potentially could. I'm with Seth. I find it kind of incredible if one function allows that conversion of any Delta Lake table.
It's just a file. But that's the thing, though. Yeah. It's just files. You're only reading flat files. The thing that's interesting here is you need to have something that understands the Delta format.
Sure.
Can read the log. The log then shows you what partitions to go read. So, I mean, Gerhard Bernecke, at the very beginning of the article, it says,
Bruckle.
Sorry, say again.
Gerhard Bruckle.
Bruckle. Sorry, I'm bad with names. So Gerhard built a version of this that was a community version of it. He read the JSON file. He was able to rip through the partitions. He did everything in the VertiPack engine. So I know his solution 100% was flat files, reading flat files and getting to the Delta structure and loading the Parquet files into the VertiPack engine without any other compute. So the fact that they're alluding to his article is an indicator to me that, like, yeah, this is a standalone, a VertiPack engine only compute things. Now, to your point, Seth, you're always going to need some compute to read them. I'm just saying you don't need a SQL Server or a Databricks compute anymore. You can now just throw tables in a Azure Data Lake Gen 2, use this, and now you don't need to stand up a SQL Server or have a Databricks SQL endpoint running anymore to load those tables. It will just work in import in desktop.
Bro, think about that though, with some of the workloads that are happening.
I'm just telling you that's yeah.
All right. I mean,
I can translate Seth's face right now.
I know his mind is getting blown as we speak.
No, it's not that easy. It's not that easy. That's what
it's not that easy.
It's not that easy. That's
this is the point I want to make. I think this is a huge moment. This is why I was like, we got to talk about this because I think this is a major thing.
Okay, so the major things, because I'll go back a bit, because when I asked you guys the initial question of what does this change, there were two questions there, but I'm very intrigued that you guys took it two different ways.
I'm sorry. As I'm thinking like large scale, how's this going to work? I see in the blog article, if you have a folder on your local PC with the path Delta
And
comp,
you're like,
oh
that's
yeah,
like
man, I just
everything
keep parquets on my local folder all the time.
Yeah, I just
They're
keep it up
huge.
to 300
They're
terabytes
massive.
of data on my
You don't have that
machine.
folder?
Yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah, which
Okay.
again for Seth, I think is confirming all his beliefs.
All right.
But I think there's two implications here, at least from where this can go, and I find it very intriguing that you guys took it both directions that I initially thought, where there is Delta Lake tables function as in part of the ETL process on Fabric and lake houses, which is the way Seth took it. And then there is the Delta Lake tables as part of a semantic model process, which is the way that Mike initially took it when I asked the question. Are those the two real use cases here? I'm thinking scenarios of where is this the most useful, or where would this actually be part of a production workflow? It's either going to be part of your data flows Gen 2 to push into lake houses, or it's going to be pushed into a semantic model.
I would agree with that statement, because what you're gonna do is you're gonna have like a raw layer of data or a bronze layer of information. You're gonna need to go, hey, I need a data flow to go pick up that Delta table, do something to it, maybe filter it, do some information to it, and then go to the next, land it back down again. I need to write it back down to the lake. So we know data flows Gen 2 already has the capability of writing Delta tables into lake. It's by default there, which means the data flow engine already understands it. What this is giving us, this is adding the capability to the semantic model, the VertiPack engine that's going to go read that stuff again. And I think Andrew asks a great question here. If we're now using this could be used as an import model to go access those data tables. Will this be better than using the Lakehouse SQL endpoint to import tables? And my answer, I think, is if you have already done the transformations, if you already have facts and dimensions, you don't need SQL anymore. Like, you don't need that endpoint to run if you have everything shaped and ready to go. And this has been my point all along. I saw this really early on, and I was like, I don't like having a SQL server running in between whatever my data stuff is doing and what Power BI is doing, because I don't want to pay for yet another machine to run just to go access data that's already stored in flat files on some system. To me, this is just Microsoft catching up to the Delta format, and now I don't need that. You can still use SQL, you can still create tables, you can then write them back down in Delta formats, but now I don't need to have a persistent SQL engine on all the time just to load the data to the models. And I think this has been a challenge for a lot of organizations, and this is in my opinion, this is a very traditional way of thinking. Oh, we have to put everything in SQL, then the SQL is available, then I can go run my Power BI against it and go get the data. And I'm saying that's an old pattern. There's new patterns evolving now, and this is one of those new patterns. You don't need a SQL compute anymore, and to do Delta, you need a Spark compute available to run that. Now that Microsoft's actually building this into data flows, which is not Spark, and now into semantic models, which is VertiPack, also not Spark, now you can just read the stuff. This is great. This is great news. Sorry, I guess I'm too excited about this.
I think you're making some assumptions, but
I'm pretty good on my. I'm pretty on point with my assumptions about what Microsoft's building. I've been pretty right. I've had a pretty good track record. Shall I go back to episode 1 of the podcast? Do I need to reference that one again?
How many were we talking? Desktop in the service?
Yes. I'm 2 for 2 now, I think.
So many steak dinners.
So many steak dinners.
All I know is my stomach's filled from steak. I don't know about yours. So you're great with the future. Historically, going back with the format.
I don't have a good memory. I would agree with you, Tommy, on that one. I don't remember things very well. I owe you a lot of steak dinners for that.
Is great to say that you have a great memory.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, things I remembered. I don't remember it, but I remembered a lot.
I was right 100% of the time, because all the things I was wrong, I forgot. Awesome. With that, we have burned through, I think it's a pretty good, let's do final summaries, final thoughts here. So let's just do a quick round of final thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up here today. Tommy, give us your final thought around this new function, Power Query M, using Delta tables.
No, I think this is just the beginning implications of really what we're going to be able to do. This is by no means the full feature set of where this capacity is going to be, I think, shown. We're only seeing just the beginnings of the function. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes.
Seth, what are your kind of impressions here? Other than that,
You
Mike's
heard
totally
it
wrong.
here from Mike Carlo. Free compute and access to all your tables, all your Delta tables via this.
Remember,
brand new
he's never wrong.
I'm just
I can't remember any time I was wrong. Let's just say it that way.
No, I like the feature, the new function. We'll see how it integrates into the workflows, and then the closer we can get to, I think, stories where we can, progress and push things that are developed at a lower level into the enterprise spaces, and use the same code, it would be fantastic. So if this is an avenue towards that direction, and yet another way we can interface and still get the same performance without refactoring things, I'm a huge fan. So
awesome. I think this is a smart evolution from Microsoft. I think this is allowing them. Delta is now becoming, I think, a standard inside the Power BI and Fabric ecosystem. You need to understand Delta. It's going everywhere. It's changing your workloads, and it's letting you do things at scale with less cost all the time. Very, very pro on this feature. Maybe we'll have to ping Chris Webb directly and make sure that we understand exactly that we don't need a SQL compute to go read Delta tables anymore. But I'm pretty confident that is what's happening here. And that's why I'm very excited about it. I think this is going to be great for people who know how to use these things. And if you're going to be extremely effective in the Fabric and or Power BI ecosystem, this is going to have to be just part of your repertoire. One thing that I'm considerate of when I think about this feature is it would be really nice if these connectors were smart enough to do incremental refreshing for imported models. So if I think about how this pattern should work, if that Delta table is extremely large and I'm trying to load 500 million rows of data, it would be really nice if this connector would fold queries back to that table and pick the right partitions based on some sort of incremental refresh policy, either like by dates. So I'm hoping that's why they're going this direction, and maybe we get some incremental refresh on top of this, so I don't have to read the entire table every time I want to load something. But I think it's a move in the right direction. So we'll see. Chris, can you please make another blog around an incremental refresh for this new feature?
Roadmap.
Let's figure that out, please. Let's get that dialed in here. So thank you all very much for listening and watching the podcast. This is the candid conversation around all the fuzzy things, the people and the process parts. And, we have a good dose of technology in here as well. But this is all the conversation, water cooler conversation around Power BI. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, learned something new. Check out the new feature. Go read the blog. It's in the description below. It's also in the chat window as well. Go read this blog. Go play with some of the data. Let me know what you find in the comments below, and we can prove Michael wrong for the first time ever. All right, Tommy, that's totally a joke. I'm always wrong. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find all the places where Mike's never wrong, on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. Helps us out a ton. Do you have a question, an idea, or a topic you want us to talk about in a future episode? Head over to powerbi.tips/podcast. Leave your name and a great question. Finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central, and join the conversation on all of Power BI Tips social media channels.
I feel like I lobbed up too much of a softball here on this one. This is too easy. It's just too easy anymore. Anyways, thank you all very much. We'll see you next time. We appreciate your time, and have a great week.